All right. Well, I have about 3 after the hour by my watch. I see some people are still joining the waiting room, but we have a packed agenda today, and I want to make sure that we get to all of it. So for those of you who are just joining, I'm Celine Blanco-Miles. I'm a senior program associate with Vera's initiative to End Girls Incarceration, and this is the first of a webinar learning series that is being sponsored by the Office of Youth and Community Restoration. Today's topic is on ending girls' incarceration. We're really excited to have everyone here who's eager to learn more about what it looks like to end girls' incarceration in your county and in your state and across the nation. So we're going to jump right in. For those of you who are still introducing yourselves, please continue to do so. So this is our agenda for today. I won't go into the entire agenda, but we want to give you an idea of what we'll be covering today. We'll start with some remarks. We'll have some small group breakouts. We're going to end this meeting promptly at 2 o'clock Pacific time. So for those of you who are joining, we'll try to be respectful of your time, but really excited about this agenda and to have everyone here today. Before we get started, I know everyone is introducing themselves in the chat, which we love to see, but we also wanted to do a quick poll. So if you're joining from a specific agency, please let us know in the chat, probation, judiciary, prosecution, public defense. If you're joining from a community-based organization or another agency, feel free to locate which letter is best, most appropriate for where you're joining us and drop it into the chat. We'd love to be able to take a poll of where professionals are joining from, who we have logging into today's meeting. So I will give folks a minute to put in some answers. I see some members of the judiciary are joining. Welcome today, probation. Great to see everybody who's here. Trying to see the answers that are coming in now. A lot of other. So great. If you're other and you're not listed here, we couldn't do a comprehensive list, but we're really glad to see a lot of folks that are joining from across different agencies who are interested in learning more about ending girls' incarceration. I see some community-based organizations are joining. Welcome. We love to see CBOs participating in these really important dialogues. We're just going to start off again for everyone who's just joining with a quick poll. These are the associated agencies we're asking you to answer where you're joining from today. And we love if you could participate. So thank you to everyone who's participating in the poll. I'm going to move us along in our agenda because we do have a packed day, but please continue to respond to the poll as well. So before we jump into the meat of talking about ending girls' incarceration, I'm actually going to pass it to Director Lucero for some brief remarks. Vera has partnered with Director Lucero in Santa Clara County for some of our work, where she worked tirelessly to implement needed changes and bring the county closer to embodying the vision that she had for young people. Director Lucero is a champion for the inclusion of system-impacted youth and girls and gender-expansive young people who are often left out of systems and out of reform processes. And we're really fortunate to be able to partner with her, not only from our time working in Santa Clara County, which that work is ongoing, but also with OYCR here under her leadership. So Director Lucero, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us in our very first webinar. We are planning to have a monthly series. My name is Katherine Lucero, and I'm the director of the California Health and Human Services Office of Youth and Community Restoration. I'm joined today by Desiree Victor. She is the lead on ending girls' incarceration for OYCR, and with Vera's Ending Girls Incarceration initiative, represented today by Nicole Brown, Tassiani Montoya, and Celine Miles. Today's webinar, as indicated, is the first in the series for us to re-envision youth justice through an accountability and health-based lens. We are within the California Health and Human Services as indicated, and so we're very interested in making sure that we bring mental health, physical health, educational health into the equation of positive youth justice. Each monthly webinar will feature experts in all aspects of caring for our youth, from education to health and healing, less restrictive programming, and more. Speakers will share proven practices and breaking research in the field of positive youth justice. OYCR's role in the transformation of California's youth justice system is to encourage and share bright spots and best practices throughout the county, throughout the state. We're showing communities how to reintegrate youth by harnessing their diverse strengths, skills, and potential in order to change their trajectory. Next slide. OYCR is a different kind of government agency. It was created by Senate Bill 823, and our approach to youth justice is rooted in expertise, research, and data. The data tells us that children of color are overrepresented in the youth justice system as youth are realigned to the counties during the significant shift designed by SB 823. There is a new opportunity to redress these racial disparities. We have a new and different opportunity to partner with counties to provide that technical assistance that we hope continues to improve and that will result in the equitable outcomes, especially for our young people of color. We're here to partner with all who are interested in doing this work on the ground, listening to your experiences, and create ways for your expertise to be shared with your counterparts across the state. Our goal is for systems-involved youth and communities to heal and to be kept safe. This requires us to lead with a human-first approach to youth justice tailored to the needs of the youth, the counties, and the communities. This approach is based on the research that meets our state's needs, and it also is consistent with our values. Next slide. Taking the lessons learned from the last 2 decades of youth justice reform, the continued evolution of youth justice in California will continue to result in a shift in the perception of what is possible for our youth, and ultimately in concrete and substantial benefits to our communities, to our youth, to our families, and to our county governments. As counties prepared for the youth to come home, to return, we've seen a tremendous dedication from county probation and from community-based organizations to ensure that youth have what they need to heal and to move on as welcome and productive members of their communities. OYCR is here to support and guide the counties and to highlight the unique approaches and successes so we can all see what's possible when we make this commitment and priority to our youth and our communities. And next slide. Partnership is the heart of driving change. By working with those involved in the justice system, OYCR acts as a guide and a resource to offer recommendations for those establishing an improved youth justice system in their counties. We call this transformational work. County and state offices and nonprofit partners like the Vera Institute for Justice are all incredibly important partners to work with. But partnership also means including system-involved youth and their families in the process and uplifting youth voices. Our aim is to be a resource hub for this broad spectrum of groups, offices, and individuals that are part of the youth justice transformation. Next slide. October is Youth Justice Action Month. This month, we're asked to recommit to actions that promote youth justice reform and to ensure that all children and youth get a fair shot at reaching their highest potential. Next slide. The theme for this year's Youth Action Month is Justice Is. You can fill in the blanks. Justice is. Today, we see with this webinar that justice is looking and addressing directly the ending the impact of incarceration of girls and gender-expansive youth. This week's theme at the national level is healing, and we think this webinar fits very nicely within that theme because this is all about healing. I would like to go ahead, next slide. I would like to go ahead and pass it over to my colleague, Desiree Victor, who will share with you a little bit more about the campaign to end the incarceration of girls in California. Desiree?
Thank you, Director. It is an honor to be a part of this as EGI lead. Prior to OYCR, I was the director of the Young Women's Freedom Center in Santa Clara County, leading the community-based response to supporting our young folks through the Santa Clara County End Girls Incarceration Initiative. Through a joint effort with dedicated and committed counties, OYCR and the Vera Institute of Justice have collaborated to initiate a statewide technical assistance effort, the Ending Girls Incarceration in California Action Network. This network aims to immediately reduce and ultimately eliminate the incarceration of girls in the state. We are eager and happy to announce that this partnership includes 4 counties: Sacramento, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Imperial. We are confident that in this partnership with Vera and the highlighted counties, we can achieve the goal of ending girls' incarceration. Vera is a national research and advocacy organization that has made significant impact throughout the country towards shifting the unnecessary overcriminalization of people of color and those experiencing poverty. Through this initiative, we will support a collaborative effort to bring together leadership from juvenile justice and other urgent child serving agencies, including advocates, service providers, and directly impacted young people as important pillars in this work. Next slide, please. Next slide. So today you will be presented with ways EGI, Ending Girls Incarceration, can work to address the matter of race and gender inequity that is reflected in the overrepresentation of Latinx and Black young women, girls, and gender-expansive youth in the juvenile justice system. Through this, we will learn about the urgency of centering girls and why it matters. Historically, most programming and reforms have centered boys and young men, critically overshadowing that girls' incarceration is and has been a matter of concern. We must address the very different issues that impact girls and gender-expansive youth of color overrepresented in the juvenile justice systems. We are now rolling up our sleeves and beginning the work to undo and shift California's history of addressing girls' incarceration through a gender-biased and unintentionally harmful approach. With that, I will pass this back to my colleague at Vera, Celine.
Thank you so much, Director Lucero and Desiree and the rest of the OYCR team. We are really excited to talk to you today about ending girls' incarceration. But before we get into it, before we talk about how we look at solutions and ways to disrupt drivers of girls' incarceration, let's start off a little bit first with who we are at the initiative to end girls' incarceration at Vera. So Vera's Ending Girls Incarceration, or EGI, you'll hear us use that term a lot over the course of today's presentation, was really created to disrupt inequities that drive girls' incarceration. And the ultimate goal is to zero out the number of young people that are locked up on the girl side of the youth legal system across the country. Getting to zero is ambitious, but we believe that it's achievable. As Des said, numbers are small, and on a given day, most states have fewer than 150 young people in girls' long-term placement facilities. And in a lot of the counties that we work with, it's actually single digits, maybe even teens at most. And because girls are smaller portions of the overpopulation, Desiree did mention that they're often not centered in analyses or conversations and policy reforms or program developments. But this is also encouraging the small numbers because it means that we have a manageable goal. And we've found that the work to end girls' incarceration in all of our sites has helped jurisdictions to address some of those intractable issues that can really impact all young people. We work with several partner jurisdictions. EGI started this work in New York City back in 2017. And in 2018, we expanded into Santa Clara County, as well as the states of Maine and North Dakota and Hawaii. because we work across so many jurisdictions, the work looks very different in each of these sites, and we know that we can't take a cookie cutter approach and simply apply the same approach in every location. So we take a collaborative approach. We gather information to get a holistic idea and understanding of what's possible and what's happening locally, to see what particular systems and resource gaps exist in each jurisdiction. And then we work individually with each site to identify and implement court-based policy and practice reforms that are needed to stop pathways to incarceration. And we've seen this work. We've seen significant reductions across all of the sites that you see here. And even Santa Clara County and New York City, two of our largest sites, have been circling zero in recent years, which is very exciting. As a part of our national effort to get to zero, we have partnered with OYCR. Earlier this year, we expanded our work to California, and we really think this is an important partnership because California accounts for roughly 13% of girls' long-term commitments nationally. And because of that, we focused a lot of our resources over the next few years. We believe that California can both lead the way and have huge impacts based off the sheer size of the state. In partnership with OYCR, we launched the California Action Network, which Desiree mentioned. These 4 sites that you see here, Imperial, Los Angeles, Sacramento, and San Diego County, will be participating over the course of 1 calendar year from June this year to June of 2024, and will be receiving support from both Vera and from OYCR to make meaningful policy practice changes that decrease the number of girls and gender-expansive youth who are incarcerated and involved in juvenile legal systems. This is a 1-year push to make real change and to set these sites up for a collaborative, holistic effort that will continue beyond this first year. The curriculum we're bringing to these sites is really based off of the successes we've seen across all the partner jurisdictions that you saw on the last slide, particularly what we've learned in Santa Clara County and the California context that we work in. And we want to take a moment to really lift up these 4 Action Network sites that have proactively committed to driving local qualitative and quantitative data to understand what's happening in their juvenile legal systems. They've committed to implementing needed changes in how their systems respond to girls and gender-expansive youth, and they are leading the state in getting to zero. And we really want to take a moment to give them praise for that step. It's difficult to lead and to take a leadership role when it comes to something like ending girls' incarceration, but these states have done that. So we'll touch a little bit more on how Vera will help these sites achieve change and how counties like yours can learn from what we're doing in the Action Network a little later in today's presentation, but wanted to give a little overview of the Action Network itself, the counties that are currently participating. Some of your colleagues are joining today's conversation, and we're really glad to be working with these 4 sites over the next calendar year. So we're going to turn in just a moment to thinking about drivers of girls' incarceration. But before we do that, we want to take a minute and ask you to participate in a brief opening exercise with us today. Pretty much every government and community leader we speak to that's doing this work, and that includes all of you that are here joining us today, are doing this work because you care about young people and because you want to create a system where all young people have opportunities to foster meaningful connections and have access to the resources that they need. And my colleague Tassi is going to speak a little bit more about how lack of resources and support networks for girls and gender-expansive youth actually create unique pathways to incarceration. But before she gets to that, we want you to take a minute and think about some of the girls' cases maybe that have resulted in detention admission in your own county, and think maybe for a moment about what were the driving factors in that decision to detain those young people. We'll give you a minute to think about it. I'm going to go silent while we give you a minute to think about this and reflect. And in a minute or so, if you would please just drop some of your thoughts into the chat. We'd love to see, again, your own reflection before we talk a little bit more deeply about what we're seeing in the counties that we work in. So we'll give you a moment for reflection. If you have some thoughts after this moment of reflection that you'd like to share in the chat, please feel free to drop those in with your colleagues and for everyone else who's joining today. And with that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Tassiani Montoya, who's going to talk with us a little bit about trans drivers and EGI's approach to success.
Thank you so much, Celine. If you don't mind just going to the next slide as well. Hi, everyone. My name is Tassiani Montoya, and I'm the most recent addition to the End Girls Incarceration initiative as the Senior Advocacy Associate on the team. I'm very happy to be here with you all. And I'm just going to ask and push you all to sort of engage in that reflection activity as well, as we dive into discussing the national trends and the journey to incarceration for girls and gender-expansive youth. I really want to invite you to hold on to the thoughts and maybe feelings that may come up for you during that reflection and what leads to the detention of young individuals, and push yourself to imagine the impact of those decisions on the young people and begin to explore what could be alternative approaches to that. Next slide, Celine, thank you. So here in the United States incarcerates more girls than any other country in the world. And on a typical day, 15% of youth in residential placements are girls. And overall, we typically see girls account for about anywhere between 15 to 25% of juvenile cases across system points. Now, but to break that down a little bit further, each year there are about 40,000 girls detention admissions across the country. And the young people who end up in these facilities are disproportionately poor, LGBTQ, transgender, nonconforming, Black, Native American, and Latina youth, and are already some of the most marginalized young people in our country. It's important to also note that nationally, we also see that roughly 40% of young people in girls' facilities identify as LGBTQ, transgender, nonconforming, compared to around the 13% on the boys' side of the system. So when we're talking about youth on the girls' side of the system, we're also talking about young people who don't identify as girls. And as Celine mentioned, these young people are consistently overlooked in our youth justice reform efforts and often left out of conversations towards ending mass incarceration. So let's talk about why girls and gender-expansive youth are incarcerated in the first place. More often than not, the primary motivation behind these incarcerations isn't centered around community safety. In fact, many individuals within the system, including judges, prosecutors, and probation officers, openly acknowledge that their decision to incarcerate don't always align with what they know to be best practices. So what we observe most frequently is that incarceration is seen as a measure to ensure a young person's own safety, or to provide access to services that every child should be able to receive within their own communities without having to go through the youth legal system. So it's really crucial to recognize that locking up young individuals for service and safety needs unjustly punishes them for the structural inequities that have already caused them significant harm. Additionally, incarceration doesn't address the service or safety needs we're concerned about, be it housing instability or risk of sexual exploitation. So for example, imagine a young girl who doesn't have a stable place to live because they don't have a permanent home or family support. They might have to stay at different friends' houses or even sleep in unsafe places. But because of this unstable housing situation, they could be at risk of being taken advantage of by people who offer them a place to stay in exchange for sexual favors or any other form of exploitation. So we need to address these issues instead of just putting young people in jail, because it does not really resolve the problems that they're facing. And eventually these young people will return to the same environments if we haven't taken the steps to address and improve those circumstances. So as we explore this further today, just consider this: how can we shift our approach to better create safety within our communities without resorting to incarceration? Because we know the majority of girls and gender-expansive youth are detained for offenses that pose no risk to public safety and that are rooted in experiences of trauma, abuse, race, and gender discrimination. So now let's begin by understanding the real life experiences of young individuals within our communities and what leads them to intersect with the juvenile justice system. So the girls and gender-expansive youth who find themselves in detention facilities often face multiple challenges, some of which have persisted for generations. These include issues like unstable housing, strained family dynamics, involvement in the child welfare system, instances of sexual abuse, commercial exploitations, domestic violence, and the weight of historical trauma and discrimination. So rather than viewing these challenges as isolated pathways to incarceration, we should really acknowledge that many of these young people are grappling with multiple adversities all at the same time. So it's really essential to recognize how girls and gender-expansive youth end up in the legal system because they are criminalized for their responses to trauma or the steps that they take to protect themselves, such as running away from an abusive group home or avoiding school where they feel unsafe. So as you engage in today's webinar, again, I'm going to push you. Let's keep asking ourselves, how can we disrupt these pathways to incarceration and provide better support for young people within our communities? Our goal here isn't merely to empty detention facilities, but to collectively address the underlying reasons behind youth incarceration. How can we work together to tackle the why behind these issues? So now I'm going to share a very brief overview of what we know about girls' incarceration in California and how it lines up with these national trends. Looking at the best statewide data available, we see that there are about 1,400 girls' detention admissions across the state in 2021. The work is fundamentally about both gender and race equity. When we look at who is being detained across the state of California, we see that it's overwhelmingly girls of color. Latino girls made up about 51% of girls' detention admissions in 2021, and together, Black and Latina girls made about 76% of girls' detention admissions. When we dig into the data by charge category, we see that a large portion of girls and gender-expansive youth continue to get arrested, petitioned, and detained on misdemeanors and status offenses. There's still real opportunity to significantly reduce the population across the state by focusing on diverting lower level charges. This is something within our reach. Too many girls are still in the system on low level offenses, and they simply do not belong there. And finally, we hold a strong belief that California has the potential to put an end to the incarceration of girls and become an example for other states nationwide. We've witnessed the incredible outcomes when stakeholders unite, craft a shared vision, and place girls and gender-expansive youth at the heart of our efforts. So again, another invite. I invite you to reflect on this aspiration together. How can we, as a collective force, continue to work towards making California a model for change? And what steps can we take to center the well-being of these young individuals? I'll now open it up for any questions before engaging in our next activity. Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to place those into the chat. We'll make sure that we're monitoring the chat for any questions that folks may have. And thank you for everyone who's already putting questions into the chat as we've been talking. Really helpful to see those questions come up in the moment as well. I'm going to give it one more moment or so. I don't see any questions that are coming through, but if you're still thinking or pondering, I'm going to wait a couple more seconds and just see if anybody has any questions that are coming to you from Tassi's presentation just now. Please feel free to include them. I see some questions are coming in. There's one about where most girls are currently incarcerated. And then a question as well about arrest petitions and detention admissions. I'll go back to that slide. But does someone from the EGI team want to jump in on where girls are currently incarcerated?
Sorry. Can I ask by where?
Do you mean like which part of the state? Is that what the question is? Okay. Can you see that, Celine?
I can. So they're asking more girls incarcerated in California compared to what, I think is the question.
So nationally, hi everyone, I'm Lindsay Rosenthal. I'm the director of the Initiative to End Girls Incarceration. Nationally, when you look at the data from Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, California, just by virtue of its size, not by rate, has more girls in juvenile placement than anywhere else in the country. It's depending on the year you look at, it's between 13 and 16% of girls incarcerated nationally. Or at least young people incarcerated nationally in girls' facilities are in California. So that's what we mean by that. And then Lisa Small, I think I saw you said more than anywhere on earth. I think we need to do a little bit more digging to affirm more than anywhere on earth. But the United States has more women and girls incarcerated than any other country. We're at the top of the list. So that might be accurate. We can get back to you and share that around after this webinar.
Thank you, Lindsay. I'm also seeing some questions about what relief looks like for girls and gender expansive youth, challenges that have come up in sites that we've worked in while trying to address this work, and trauma-informed care. I think some of those questions may be answered when we get to the latter portion of our conversation. So I'm happy to move us along and hopefully they get answered. And if not, please come back to those questions when we talk a little bit more about the work that we've done, what that looks like, and how the approach has worked itself out in some of the counties where we've already started to do some of this really important work. So we're going to move to some breakout groups. We want this to be interactive. We want you to get a lot out of today's discussion and not just have us talk at you. So we're going to separate you out into some small groups. You'll have about 15 or so minutes to go over the discussion, introduce yourselves, and please do introduce yourselves to the other folks that are in your breakout group, as not everyone may be joining from the same area or the same location or jurisdiction. You'll be in a groups about 3 to 5. So hopefully with 15 minutes to discuss, you'll have enough time to do some introductions and also to think about these prompts. We're going to be pausing the recording while you are in breakout sessions. So please don't feel like any of your responses will be recorded. They're not. And then we'll bring you back after 15 minutes and maybe reflect a little bit together on some of what you discussed in your breakout groups. So my colleague Sarah is going to sort everybody into breakout groups. You should see a pop-up come up on your screen to be sorted into a breakout group. And we will see you back in about 15 minutes or so. The prompts are here. So what's resonated the most currently with what's happening in your county currently? And to the question that we got in the chat, what are some of the biggest obstacles that your county would need to address to end girls incarceration locally? Those are the 2 prompts. We'll make sure that they are in the chat as well for you before you are sorted into groups. So with that, we will let you go forth into your breakout groups. Conversations were meaningful. I hope you were really able to sit with the prompt to speak with some of your colleagues, maybe meet some people that you didn't know, talk about some things that are challenges that would need to be addressed in your local jurisdictions. If you are going to think about addressing girls incarceration in your locality. Before we get going with the rest of our presentation today, I just want to ask anyone, if you have something to share, if you'll just drop it in the chat. It could be a few sentences about what your group discussed, some things that really stuck out to you about the conversation that you just had with some colleagues or with some folks that you didn't know or hadn't been able to connect with up until this point. We would love to see some of what you discussed in your meetings and your small group breakouts. We didn't sit in on them, but would love to hear some of what you shared. So if you have some thoughts that you'd like to share, just go ahead and feel free and put those into chat. And we will continue on with the rest of today's discussion. So I am going to advance the slides. Technology. So now we're going to move to getting to zero. We've talked about drivers of girls incarceration so far in today's discussion. We've thought about unique pathways to incarceration for girls and gender expansive youth. And now we're going to switch some gears and think about solutions that jurisdictions have used or that they're currently implementing to disrupt these drivers. But before we talk about those changes that stakeholders can and should make, it's really important to us at Vera and OYCR that we emphasize that the incarceration of children and adolescents is the direct result of systemic and cultural failures. The circumstances that land young people in handcuffs or facilities don't just stem from their own choices. They occur within a broader context of structural race and gender discrimination, poverty, and a lack of access to resources, and the many harms that young people experience within their own communities. At Vera and the partners that we work with, we ask them all to think in jurisdictions to think about policy change, practice change, and programmatic investment in the broader context of advancing the freedom of girls and gender-expansive youth. As you can see here, advancing freedom on the slide. In practice, that does mean cutting numbers in detention, placement, and probation, and limiting and restricting the formal legal system involvement to the smallest proportion of cases possible, ending the misuse of youth legal systems to address service needs and individual safety concerns, and to deeply and critically examine what it means to pose an imminent threat to public safety and what resources already exist to mitigate that risk in communities. But it also means ending the criminalization of girls and gender-expansive youth by investing heavily in community-based resources to ensure that rights are fulfilled and that challenges that are met with increases support as opposed to punishment. And that means that this work cannot just live within juvenile justice legal agencies or even within government agencies alone. Probation leaders, judges, prosecutors hold a lot of power and decision-making, and that determines a lot of young people's trajectories through the legal system. But this is only going to be successful, the work that we're talking about today, if you bring other social services, community leaders, and directly impacted young people, advocates, and families together so that we can build out those community-based supports, those supports that live outside of those systems, so young people can be safe and healthy at home. So that's really one of the first things that we want to think about with jurisdictions, and really important for us to think about and center in this discussion before we move on to, what are those policy changes and those practices that you're all very eager to hear about. So with that foundation that we've just set on advancing freedom and making sure that we're holding that in tandem with the work that we're going to do, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Nicole, who's going to walk us through what approach and TA processes can look like in jurisdictions.
Thank you, Celine. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Brown. I'm a Senior Advocacy Associate with the EGI team. I use she, her pronouns. I'm happy to be here. And actually, if we could switch to the next slide, please. Wonderful. So how do we use all this knowledge that we just learned about the context and trends of girls' incarceration to create local solutions and real systems change that cut girls' numbers and advance girls' freedoms? Well, the Vera EGI team uses a systematic approach to achieve our goals in a way that is data-informed while fostering collaboration and transparency across government agencies and community stakeholders, including girls and gender-expansive youth and their families, so that we can ultimately get to zero. Our approach has 3 components, and as you can see, transparency and collaboration are key elements at every step of the process. First, we conduct a diagnostic assessment to identify which pathways seem to be the strongest drivers of girls' incarceration locally, such as housing instability or family conflict. And we identify the policies and practices in place that seem to be propelling girls' cases deeper into the system. This information then informs a strategic planning process for how local systems can disrupt those drivers through targeted policies and programmatic investments. And then the last phase is implementation and continued planning across agencies and community stakeholders to further develop and implement recommendations and to troubleshoot problems that may arise along the way. Next. So looking at our diagnostic process, it's an important starting point, and it can include many elements. Stakeholder conversations allow us to hear diverse perspective on what's happening and how problems can be addressed. It's important to include a range of stakeholders in this process, from government leadership and line staff across systems, the advocates and providers that work closely with youth in the community, and young people and families directly impacted by the policies and decisions. These stakeholder conversations are also the key source for local resource mapping to get a sense of what programs and services do and do not exist for girls and gender-expansive youth in any particular community. Data sharing and analysis is also key for us to be data informed and to identify gender and racial disparities in the outcomes of the youth legal system. In jurisdictions we've worked in, agencies rarely ever have looked at data by gender, let alone by gender and race. And case files reviews facilitate a deeper understanding of girls' experiences that are driving girls' incarceration that may not be distinguishable from administrative data and interviews alone. Learning from case files include understanding young people's prior contact with the child welfare system, any mental health or educational issues they may have experienced, and how they had first come into contact and moved through the juvenile legal system. For policy review, we use the learnings from our diagnostics to identify needed policy changes to disrupt girls' pathways to incarceration and to promote their diversion into the community. As we move from diagnostic assessments to identifying needed policy changes, it's important to note that reforms may be needed across child-serving agencies, not just those in the juvenile legal system. This slide shows some of the key systems or organizations that have the power and decision-making authority to directly influence how girls and gender-expansive youth enter and move through the legal system. Implementing solutions will require collaboration across multiple agencies. For example, probation may decide to no longer recommend detention in response to challenges arising from child welfare placements, but the courts will need to be brought in to adjust their orders, the orders that they make. Child welfare will also need to be brought in on board so they can collaborate with probation and staff in finding solutions. And it will likely be important to collaborate with community-based organizations that can support young people and their placements to ensure that the solutions are successful. As we've discussed throughout today's presentation, these challenges do not happen in silos, so the solutions can't happen in silos either. Something that we have found to be helpful as we begin to discuss a sometimes overwhelming conversation about policy and practice change is to use the triangle framework that you see before you to narrow and locate our focus. The triangle displayed here shows 3 levels of reform. The smallest portion, or the tip of the triangle, represents reforms or solutions that are most directly tied to the drivers of girls' incarceration and that most immediately reduce the number of girls and gender-expansive youth in custody. This impacts the smallest number of young people, but has the most direct impact on custody numbers. Then we move down to reforms that indirectly affect custody, and finally reforms that support the well-being of youth more broadly. As you move down the triangle, the reforms and solution impact more young people, but the impact on custody is often less direct, may take more time to manifest, and may be harder to track or evaluate. When we talk about court-based solutions, we are focused on the tip of the triangle. We are looking for action steps that can be taken to immediately cut girls' numbers, prevent their entry into the legal system, and disrupt racial and gender disparities. Programmatic investments and broader reform planning often start to move down the triangle towards diversion and eventually prevention. Let's take the previous example we talked about with child welfare arising from child welfare placements to explore what this might look like in this triangle framework. At the top of this triangle, this might be a policy change to prevent young people's detention for reasons rooted in child welfare placement challenges, such as conflicts or running away. Here, another example could be cross-agency case conferencing efforts to troubleshoot solutions for crossover cases. At the second tier, we might see a new investment to connect child welfare placements with gender-responsive programs that can work with young people and with staff or foster care parents to improve communication, address challenges, and connect them to other needed resources. And at the bottom part of the triangle, we might see improvements to child welfare placement continuum, including recruitment and training for foster care parents. This is just one example of many, and you are all here representing many different agencies and community groups. So as you listen to this webinar and as you reflect on it afterwards, we encourage you to think about the tools that you have at your disposal. What discretion, decision-making power, or other power do you have to limit how young people touch and move through the youth legal system? Now that you have heard about our approach and to technical assistance and policy change, let's return to the Action Network to see how this ties back to our overall framework. This slide lists the key outcomes each county in the network is committed to achieving. First, data sharing, and stakeholder interviews will allow for a robust and collaborative diagnostic process and assessment. Then, informed by these diagnostics, each site will implement at least one court-based policy or formalized practice change to immediately reduce the number of girls and gender-expansive youth coming into detention facilities. This is the top of the triangle that I mentioned. Counties must also develop a concept for gender-responsive programs or a gender-responsive program that will address a key gap in the continuum of community-based resources. In most jurisdictions that we've worked in, one of the first issues to arise is an overall lack of gender-responsive diversion and prevention services. We work closely with researchers from NYU who looked at literature on gender-responsive programming, and they have found that many jurisdictions rely on programs that have been confirmed as evidence-based practices by the Federal Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention or other federal agencies. Unfortunately, girls and gender-expansive youth have largely been left out of the equation when developing these evidence-based practices, and there are few programs out there that specifically target girls' unique needs and experiences in a gender-responsive way. Many of the programs endorsed through federal agencies have not been reviewed for their effectiveness in serving girls and gender-expansive youth. And those who have been reviewed for their impact on girls find that they are either completely ineffective or worse, even harmful for girls. Meanwhile, we know that promising research-informed programs for girls do exist, but most of those programs haven't had the resources to be evaluated at the standard required to be considered evidence-based practice. In California, the Young Women's Freedom Center serves as a model for gender-responsive programming for system-impacted young people, and they have been central to ending girls' incarceration work in Santa Clara County. Building on our partnership in Santa Clara, we are working with the Young Women's Freedom Center in the Action Network to partner with local CBOs and agencies to examine local needs and how the county can best address those resource gaps for girls and gender-expansive youth. And lastly, in addition to the program-related advancements, each county will work towards creating a long-term reform and sustainability plan with an emphasis on local collaboration across government agencies and community stakeholders to allow for continued learning and shared accountability to ensure that everyone is working in concert to implement, monitor, and continue building on reforms. Next slide, please. So you are probably wondering, what do some of these policy solutions look like? I'm going to share a few examples from some of the places that we've worked. And what's exciting is that we'll continue to add to this list as we continue to work with new sites. To start at the top, each of the sites that we've worked with have worked on a release planning process to get as many young people out of custody as possible, while simultaneously focusing on policy and practice changes needed to keep kids from coming in. In Maine, those two things came together in a type of case conferencing process. The Department of Corrections and Probation convened what they called regional care teams across the state with local CBOs from each of those regions to look closely at each young person in custody and work together along with that young person to build a plan to support them in the community. After release, instead of them being brought back into detention for violations of conditions, those regional care teams came back together when young people were facing challenges, and they worked to adjust case planning accordingly to prevent custody. Moving to the next header, one of the key findings that emerged from Santa Clara's diagnostic assessment was that the majority of girls' admissions to juvenile hall were on overrides to the detention risk assessment instrument. In response, courts and probation leadership worked together to create a presumption against detention in those cases and encouraged case conferencing as early as possible to prevent initial detention for girls who had low or medium risk scores at intake. In New York City, where many of the girls involved in the legal system were foster care youth who experienced challenges in congregate care settings, the Child Welfare Agency worked closely with congregate care providers and local law enforcement precincts to improve staff's de-escalation skills and to reduce calls to police. Collaborating with law enforcement at this level also helped to inform and better prepare officers to help avoid young people's arrest when police were called in. Changes within the prosecutor's office in New York City further cemented this shift. They created a new position originally focused specifically on the cases that were where there were concerns of commercial sexual exploitation or CSEC, but they quickly expanded this role to advise prosecutors on all girls' cases with the goal of increasing dismissals and pre-filing diversion. The new position is responsible for improving prosecutor training on gender pathways and gender responsive resources across the city, reaching out to homelessness and housing providers in particular to expand the roster of programming and referrals that prosecutors can make. The person in this position also works with line prosecutors to encourage them to communicate with other systems and take advantage of diversion opportunities without filing or the threat of filing. And in Santa Clara, we also saw access to diversion increase at multiple system points. But one place to flag is that the public defenders began working to connect girls and to gender responsive programming and supports immediately upon receiving a referral, and were able to use initial success to advocate in the courts for release and more limited community supervision. And if you want to learn more about the work in Santa Clara County, I know we have some folks, I think, on the call from Santa Clara. We're excited to announce that the county will be releasing a best practice guide and toolkit in the coming months. So please be sure to stay connected with OYCR and Vera's EGI team to access those resources when they are released. Moving to the example of Hawaii, Mark Patterson, the warden of the Hawaii Youth Correctional Facility, leveraged the power he had to release young people by immediately convening multidisciplinary team meetings as soon as he knew a girl was being committed to his facility, with the goal of developing a release plan and moving that young person back into the community as quickly as possible. He shared each success story with judges and used that to advocate against commitment in future cases, encouraging the courts to instead try a community-based alternative. And now Hawaii is working to institute a system navigator who can be assigned to a young person at their first contact with the system and stay with them throughout their journey to connect them to services without necessitating further court involvement. So these are just some examples, and we're excited to be continuing the work in California and with these Action Network sites and beyond, as we talked about. We know that you're also probably curious, if you don't know already, about what incarceration of girls and gender-expansive youth look like in your county and how you can take action. So we're excited to announce that we will also be releasing a statewide report in partnership with the Young Women's Freedom Center in early 2024. This will cover key data from each county in California, and it will uplift recommendations for local and statewide reforms. So please stay tuned for this report and its release, and join the movement to end incarceration of girls and gender-expansive young people in California. And then, yes, I see in the slide, I'll pause and see if there's questions.
As before, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We have several EGI staff that are joining, as well as OYCR staff. I know there were some questions from before as well that we're happy to go back and address. So if you have questions, please do lift them up. We're happy to answer any questions you might have. I know one question that came up before, which might make sense to talk about now, since we've gone over some of the sites that we've worked in, was challenges that we faced in some of the jurisdictions we've worked in addressing girls' incarceration. I don't know if anyone from the EGI team would like to speak to some of those challenges. I know that there are challenges that we come across doing this work. We wish there weren't, but there are some. So I'll toss it to some of my colleagues if you have any challenges that you would lift up. That might be helpful for this group to think about as they're also seeking to do some work. And then I also see some folks have their hands up as well. So if you would please put your questions in the chat, we're happy to answer them. But first, we'll start with the question about challenges.
I can go, Celine. So some challenges that I've seen working on behalf of the community-based organization, as well as participating in collectives or collaborations, like in Santa Clara County, we have the Juvenile Justice Gender Responsive Task Force. That entity and collective in itself was addressing one of the challenges that we see now as we're expanding to other counties throughout the state, is really bridging and connecting community-based organizations to system partners, stakeholders like probation or child welfare as available entities in the community that are already doing the work. That is one of the challenges that we are working to navigate through.
I can add to that. This is Lindsay again. I worked nationally on these issues, and I loved the opportunity to partner with Desiree in Santa Clara County. I think across the board, data to really inform the unique experiences of girls, but particularly gender expansive youth who are kind of invisible across all data sets, and then be able to use that to inform their experiences. Is one challenge that we see across sites, and one of the reasons why we started doing case file reviews, because that approach can yield information that's often not available in the statistic. And then housing resources for young people is a challenge across the board that we've worked to address. And I think most communities also lack truly gender responsive, culturally responsive diversion programming to help keep prevention and diversion programs to help keep young people out of the system. So we've helped to build and design those, but it's always a challenge to identify sustainable funding sources and things like that. So we've worked through those challenges.
Are there other questions that folks have? I'm not seeing any in the chat, but we would love for you, if you have questions, to add them. While folks are still thinking about questions, I know another challenge is that this work takes time. I think everyone on this call would like for this work to happen overnight and for our systems to change and for everyone to partner very quickly. But I think it's easy for us to want that, and a lot of times this work happens more slowly. So that's another challenge I know that comes up in a lot of sites that we've worked in across the country. I see another question in the chat. It says, when a law enforcement representative says something like, well, we can't do X because of state law. Are there ways that we've kind of worked on some of those challenges that have come up in sites where our hands are tied because of statute, and maybe certain partners are pointing to that statute as a way to not do some of the work that we think needs to happen?
I can take a first pass at starting this and invite colleagues to join in. But I do think that to me, that kind of goes back to the slide I shared with all of the different stakeholders and the power and discretion at multiple points in the system. So there are pre-arrest diversion programs in some parts of California, and they have been very successful, and I think have worked with law enforcement in many cases to divert youth at before they are booked. However, there are other, as we pointed out, different points in the system, from the prosecutors, probation, et cetera, and even working with the courts to better understand policy and practice changes that can happen. And so for me, not if that it's just this collective, as we talked about. And so I think and hopefully the collective can also help move along some of those other stakeholders if they are skeptical or unsure how they can make change themselves.
And speaking on our experience in Santa Clara County, as we learned through this model and approach, is many times it was really an issue of awareness, and it came down to actually educating folks that actually know the statute does say X, Y, and Z pertaining to the subject that we are addressing. So I think these collective and having all these different folks at the table having these discussions really does broaden that understanding and education on what the actual law is versus an internal practice or policy.
Well, I don't see any additional questions. I'm going to throw a last call to see if anyone has any additional questions that they would like to put into the chat. Please feel free to add them if you have them. But with that, I'm going to actually pass it to our partners back at OYCR if there are no further questions, who are going to help round out today's presentation.
Okay, so I think it's me now again, correct? Is that a yes?
Go ahead.
Yeah?
Yes, Director.
Okay. All right. Thank you. First of all, I just do want to thank you for joining us today. And we're going to continue to learn more about California specifically as we progress in the California campaign to end girls' incarceration and gender-expansive youth. I did see a comment about applying these concepts to boys, and I want us to all understand that everything that we learn, every protocol and practice change will benefit all youth in our systems. And starting somewhere is what's important. So I just want you to know that that question is a good question. And we are going to have so many lessons learned. In Santa Clara, where I was the presiding judge when we started the campaign years ago, we were able to begin to translate some of the changes to all youth when we started to learn how to do things differently. So I just wanted to comment on that for a brief moment. Aside from the Ending the Girls Incarceration campaign, I wanted to also let you know that we have other activities going on at OYCR, including a California Tribal Families Coalition, really focusing on data and making sure that we are doing what we can to implement best practices around ICWA for JJ kids. We're doing this by having listening sessions and then providing trainings that will be provided to both our tribal communities and to our probation departments. We're also doing a family engagement initiative, which is a services for youth at Pine Grove Conservation Camp with the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, to make sure that parents can see their kids, that the transportation is available, and that while they're at the site, that they can get support from one another, from other parents with other youth that are also at that location, and really take advantage of the opportunity to heal and be supportive together. We also have an evidence-based program compendium that we're involved with RAND and with CCJVH, which is another state agency that focuses on criminal justice and behavioral health. And that is going to be launched shortly. We have an ombuds division, publications around the Youth Bill of Rights. We've been getting Youth Voice involved in the best way to present the Youth Bill of Rights and get the Youth Bill of Rights to our youth who are in the facilities across California. We also have had some funding opportunities that that we've released. We have a community-based organization capacity building opportunity where there will be a technical assistance and funding to CBOs serving young people in the juvenile justice system, and really focus on sustainability and capacity building. We have some intensive transitional services dollars for youth with acute mental health needs available to the counties, and that's an ongoing basis. And then we are also funding counties who are looking at ways to have youth move out of the secure youth treatment facilities and into the community in partnership with CBOs into less restrictive programming, which is innovative funding opportunities to be creative in the local jurisdictions around how youth can move out of those highly restrictive custodial settings and into either home with intensive quality wrap or into community-based organizations. So there's a lot going on, and we are going to make sure you have our website before we close out. And I'm going to hand it back over to Desiree for a wrap up.
Thank you. So as we close, I do want to take a moment to uplift our excitement and urgency in continuing this work. I have seen and I know firsthand that the healing and supporting of young women is best done outside of the system. But in order to get there, it takes this collaborative. And with that, I want to say thank you to the partnering counties, again, Sacramento, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Imperial, for their bold commitment to this initiative. I would like to extend our immense gratitude to Vera for their diligent efforts and steadfast commitment to supporting girls and gender-expansive youth, and for partnering with us. Here are some ways to stay involved. So we have a new OYCR website. Please do check it out. On here, you'll be able to have access to sign up for newsletters and invitations to our upcoming webinars like this one in this series. You can also follow us on our social media with the handles you see here, and you can always contact us at the oycr@chhs.ca.gov. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.